Welcome to this presentation on New South Wales crime trends during COVID. I'm Karen Freeman. I'm one of the team at the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. So today I'm talking about monitoring crime trends during COVID, looking at why we undertook some analysis, what we found and implications for the justice system. 2020 has brought a rapidly changing landscape with the onset of COVID-19. There was no precedent set for this, and the government was asking for data-driven decision making. Well, the primary response has been a public health response. This has been a very big impact on the criminal justice system as well. Firstly, there's enforcement of the public health orders that were introduced in New South Wales. There's also maintaining an effective legal system while minimising the spread within the criminal justice system. Community safety has to be maintained, and all of this has to be done within limited resources. So what I'm looking at today is a focus on changes in crime rates, looking at break and enters, theft from retail, motor vehicle theft, robbery, non-domestic assaults and domestic assaults. Now, when we're looking at these types of trends, we need to look at what was happening prior to COVID. We also need to look at whether an offence is subject to seasonal variation. We can also consider the overall volume of this offence type and how much weekly or monthly variation we should be expecting. Is there enough data to look at trends? Is this a measure of offending or policing? And also consider how sensitive this offence is to changes in reporting. So what did we find? Firstly, let's just look at some mobility trends in New South Wales during the COVID-19 period that we've seen so far to date. So looking at this mobility trend data from Apple driving direction requests, we can see that in New South Wales, there was a large drop in social mobility from March to April, and then a gradual increase again up until June and July. So this period around the end of March and throughout April is often referred to as the lockdown, when they had the most stringent restrictions in New South Wales. Now, looking at these theft offences, we can see the 2020 incident count is in black. There's the projection or the forecast for 2020 in purple, and a dotted line, which was the 2019 incidents. So what we can actually see here is that for all of these offence categories, what we actually saw in 2020 from April onwards was a large reduction from what was forecast and a large reduction from what we were seeing in 2019. This was particularly pronounced for break and enter dwellings and also for steal from retail stores. Looking at violent offences, we can see that for robbery, there was a similar pattern. A very sharp decline was seen for robbery from April onwards, very much lower than the forecast and much lower than what we were seeing in 2019. Again, a very similar pattern for non-domestic violence-related assaults, with a reduction happening slightly before the beginning of April, much lower than the forecast and lower than 2019. But turning our attention to DV assault, domestic violence-related assaults, we see a bit of a different pattern. It's also important to note that there was already an increasing trend in the 2 years and 5 years prior to March 2020. And what we can see here is that while there was some reduction throughout April in DV-related assaults, it was not nearly as much as what we were seeing for non-domestic related assaults. And when you actually look closely at the chart, you can see there's actually an area of sensitivity around the forecast, and that the numbers that we were seeing in 2020 throughout April were actually within that forecast range. So actually not out of expectation. So what happened once restrictions started to get lifted? Well, what we're looking at here is theft offences, and we're seeing the 2019 incident data in black, and the coloured line represents 2020 to June. So we can see here that big dip in April. We can see it was maintained through May for most of these offence categories. And then for some categories, there was an increase in June. So we look at motor vehicle theft, breaking into non-dwelling and steal from retail store. There seems to be a slight increase from May to June, but still very much below what we were seeing in 2019. Turning to violent offences, we see a very different picture. So looking at robbery and assault, it's non-DV assault, we see that big drop in April. But what we start to see is a gradual increase in May. And then by June, we actually see the incident count being very much in par with where it was in 2019 at the same time. When we look at domestic assault, we're seeing a different picture again. What we're seeing is, again, a very stable incident count throughout the whole time period, and not much difference to what we were seeing in 2019. What we do see is a slight dip in April and a slight increase in June, but again, really not outside what we would ordinarily expect in terms of month-to-month variation. But let's take a closer look at domestic assault. We've been hearing in the media a great deal of concern about domestic violence and reports of a big uptick, spike, surge in domestic violence related incidents. Now, why isn't our data showing the same sort of result? Measuring the levels of domestic violence has always got its challenges. So what we were looking at here is a metric that could give us a consistent pre-COVID, post-COVID time series, consistent use of definitions and application of counting rules, consideration of whether their metric might be subject to reporting bias. Also think about what targeted surveys might provide. While they might be very good with rich qualitative data, they're not so good for providing prevalence or trend data unless they're population-based. And we'd also need to consider the independence and the quality of the data collection and the analysis that's been undertaken. So turning to the sources of data that we actually look to, we actually try to get information on crisis accommodation referrals, but as with a lot of information, it's just not available in a timely fashion. So it was too late for us to use immediately. The same was true for hospital emergency department data. So what we're really using is police recorded crime data and call volumes for the DV helpline, which is a statewide 24-hour domestic violence service. Well, what can we tell from the data? Well, one of the limitations of looking at DV assault incidents in general is that they are going to be subject to changes in reporting, especially if we have victims at home with perpetrators and unable to seek assistance. So we looked at the most serious type of assaults, which is assaults resulting in grievous bodily harm. They normally require some kind of medical attention or hospital admission, so much less sensitive to changes in reporting. And what we see here is actually it's very closely aligned in 2020 to what was happening in 2019. There's slightly higher number of assaults in May compared with 2019, but by June they're back to normal. So there's really no substantial uptick or spike that we can see throughout this period, and really probably looks like what we might see with just a normal variation. Looking at DV helpline data is really useful because we're not just restricting our observation of domestic violence to criminal incidents or to people who report to the police. So here what we're looking at is really a generally higher call volume throughout 2020 compared to 2019. So while the call volume was higher throughout the lockdown period, this trend started much earlier than COVID-19 and earlier than the restrictions that were put in place. It also shows if you just look at 1 month, say April, then we could actually falsely conclude that there was a big surge in that month compared to 2019. But when you look at it across the time series, you see that that increase was already happening. I also want to look at DV assault victim counts because this can also give us a different perspective to the incident count. Here we are looking at all DV assaults, but broken down by victims and type of victims. So just here looking at victims with an intimate partner violence relationship to the offender, we see a slightly different pattern when we look at family violence. So here we see that with IPV, there was a slight dip in April compared with 2019 and a slight increase in June compared to 2019. Now, these differences weren't seen for family violence and suggest that perhaps there are different things happening for different types of victims. And what are the implications? Well, the messaging really is pretty clear that there was a fall in property crime and some types of violent crime during those most stringent COVID-related restriction periods, especially in April 2020. It's also pretty clear that the sharp decline in non-DV assaults wasn't seen for DV assaults during the same period. However, we also didn't see any observable spike or surge in DV assaults reported to the police during this time. And our closer look at the DV data for DV GBH and for the DV helpline also doesn't show any surge where we might expect it to be apparent if there was an increase in DV assaults. What we are seeing now is that there is an increase in some types of crime, particularly in some violent crime from mid-2020, and it seems to be reflecting a return to pre-pandemic crime rates. So really a return to what we were forecasting prior to COVID-19. And it should be kept in mind that we were actually experiencing some historically low crime rates for some of these offence types. In terms of resourcing, there was an anticipated increase in risk, at least, for domestic violence victims. So police had increased their ADVO compliance checks, and you can see on this chart just how much they escalated these checks during that lockdown period. So this is where police actually go and check up on people who have got an ADVO and make sure that the conditions of that ADVO have been enforced. There was also additional funding put in place for service provision and housing and specialist services for DV victims. What other downstream impacts might we be seeing? Well, particularly as we see some of those violent crimes beginning to increase again, there might be service implications for hospitals, for courts, and including for bail decisions, which would then flow on to things like remand centres, prisoners, and also things like delivery of probation and parole services. So these are all going to have implications on resource allocation. If you're interested in finding out more or reading our publications or using our crime tool, come and visit us at our website or drop us a line, contact us by email or by phone. Thank you.